booming while others seem stuck?
Mm.
You've handed us why nations fail.
Yeah.
So clearly, you're as captivated by this question as we are.
Right.
Get ready to explore the surprising reasons some countries thrive while others, well, don't.
And get this, the answers aren't as obvious as you might think.
Okay.
This isn't just about geography or resources.
Yeah.
It's way more interesting than that.
Right. Acemoglu and Robinson throw down this gauntlet right away
Yeah.
with the example of North and South Korea.
Yeah.
Talk about a head-scratcher. Same people, same land, but worlds apart in terms of prosperity.
It's true.
It's like they're two sides of the same coin,
Yes.
but one's gold and the other, no, not so much.
What's fascinating here is that the authors argue that the difference boils down to institutions.
Okay.
Not just the buildings, but the rules of the game.
Okay.
The laws, the norms, how much, say, people have in their own economic destinies.
Okay, see, institutions, that sounds a bit dry. Like, should I be taking notes right now?
Yeah.
But when you put it that way, the rules of the game, suddenly I'm seeing everything from global politics to my local farmer's market in a whole new light.
Exactly. And just like in any game, the rules matter.
Right.
Acemoglu and Robinson distinguish between what they call inclusive and extractive economic institutions, and understanding the difference is key to understanding why some nations fail while others flourish.
All right, break it down for me. Inclusive versus extractive. It's a bit ominous sounding, no?
Yeah, it's a good way to put it.
What separates the haves from the have-nots on this institutional level?
Picture this. You're in a society where you can own property, and those rights are actually protected. The law applies to everyone equally. You can start a business, hire folks, and the government provides basic services like education. That's the essence of inclusive economic institutions, a level playing field where everyone has a shot.
And South Korea is held up as the shining example of this in action, right? I mean, they went from war-torn to economic powerhouse, and what felt like a blink, categorically speaking.
And the authors argue that it was precisely because they adopted these inclusive institutions, at least economically. Now, it wasn't all rosy. Park Chung-hee's rule wasn't exactly a picnic, but there was this foundation of property rights, investment in education that set the stage.
And it's wild how the book brings this to life. They talk about these two brothers separated during the Korean War, one ending up in the north, the other in the south. Years later, they reunite, and the difference is staggering. The South Korean brother, doing what? Even owns a car.
Wow.
The North Korean brother, not starving, but clearly struggling. Talk about a real-life illustration of these abstract ideas.
And if you need more convincing, they have this incredible satellite image of the Korean peninsula at night.
Oh, wow.
The south, ablaze with light reflecting its economic activity. The north, shrouded in darkness, a stark visual representation of how those differing paths played out.
Wow. Okay, so we're not just talking about GDP numbers here. This is impacting people's lives on a fundamental level.
Right.
But before we go any further, I need to know more about how these inclusive institutions actually work. What makes them tick?
It all comes down to incentives and who benefits from them. Remember those key features we talked about? Secure property rights, impartial law, public services. They create an environment where individuals are incentivized to contribute, to innovate, because they know they'll reap the rewards of their efforts.
So it's not just about being nice or fair, though I'm sure those things are lovely. It's about creating a system where individual ambition actually fuels the collective good.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And this is where it gets even more intriguing, because the book argues that this isn't just some feel-good philosophy. It's backed by historical evidence.
Lay it on me. What kind of evidence?
Well, let's talk about Barbados. Now, you might think, Caribbean island, beaches, sunshine, surely a poster child for inclusive institutions, but hold on.
Barbados. Okay, you've got my attention. What's the twist?
Well, back in the 17th century, Barbados had this system of well-defined property rights, but only for a select few.
Okay.
The sugar plantation owners, to be precise.
So inclusive for some, not so much for others.
Right.
I'm sensing a but coming.
But of course. These planters also conveniently controlled the courts and the government. So much for impartial law and a level playing field.
It's like that old saying, power corrupts.
And absolute power corrupts, absolutely. The authors make this point: it wasn't real inclusivity because it depended on a system of forced labor, with enslaved people having zero rights.
Right.
Even though Barbados saw economic activity, it wasn't sustainable because it left the majority behind, trapped in a system rigged against them.
Okay, that's a sobering reminder that inclusive isn't just a box you check.
Right.
It has to be woven into the fabric of how a society operates.
Exactly. And this brings us to a really crucial point that might surprise some listeners. We often think of economic freedom as getting the government out of the way, right? But Why Nations Fail argues that a strong state is actually essential for inclusive institutions to work.
Hold on, really. So it's not just any government, it's about the right kind of government.
Right.
Tell me more, because this goes against everything I thought I knew.
Think of it this way. You need a referee in the game, right? Someone to enforce the rules, ensure fair play, and that's where the state comes in. It's about creating an environment where everyone can thrive, not just a select few.
So we're talking about things like enforcing contracts, protecting property rights, the kind of stuff that prevents things from turning into a free-for-all.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And here's the kicker. It also means providing those essential public services we talked about earlier: education, infrastructure, even basic health care.
Right.
Without these things, you don't have a level playing field. You have a system where some are set up to succeed and others are destined to struggle.
Wow. Okay, so it's not big government versus small government. It's about smart government.
Yeah.
A government that actively creates the conditions for widespread prosperity.
You got it.
Yeah.
And that brings us to the flip side of the coin: extractive institutions.
All right, let's talk about those. Because honestly, knowing human nature, it almost seems inevitable that some folks would try to rig this system in their favor.
It's a tale as old as time, sadly.
Right.
And the motivations vary. Sometimes it's outright greed, a desire to hoard wealth and power.
Right.
Other times it's about maintaining control, clinging to the status quo, even if it's harmful in the long run.
So less about baking a bigger pie for everyone to share and more about making sure they get the biggest slice.
Sadly, yes. And the consequences are often devastating. They use the example of the Congo, which has a long and tragic history of extractive institutions, both under colonial rule and afterward.
Right, where even back in the 1500s, you had this brutal system where the king and his cronies basically treated the entire country as their personal piggy bank.
Yeah.
No wonder there was no incentive for anyone else to try and get ahead. It would all just get taken away.
Precisely. And tragically, that pattern continued even after independence.
Yeah.
Mobutu Sese Seko, the dictator of Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of Congo, took extractive institutions to a whole new level.
Oh, you mean like his little habit of chartering a Concorde supersonic jet from Air France just to go shopping in Paris?
Stockles. Yeah.
All while his people were struggling to even get basic necessities?
Yeah, I think that pretty much sums it up.
Right.
Talk about a disconnect between the rulers and the ruled. It's a stark reminder that extractive institutions don't just hurt the economy as a whole, they erode the very fabric of society.
It's like this vicious cycle. The more extractive the institutions, the more incentive those in power have to keep them that way.
Unfortunately, yes.
But here's where my mind is really blown. The book claims even these extractive systems can experience economic growth. How is that even possible? It's like they say the house always wins, right? But if the house is built on shaky ground, how can it keep growing?
It's a good question.
It doesn't seem to make sense.
And it gets to the heart of some of the more nuanced arguments in the book.
Okay.
The authors describe two main ways that extractive systems can see economic growth, at least for a time.
Okay.
Firstly, you have cases where the elite essentially controls the growth directly.
So not just grabbing the biggest slice, but controlling the whole bakery.
Exactly. Think back to those Caribbean plantations we talked about.
Right.
These were horrifically extractive systems, but they did generate a lot of wealth for the plantation owners, that is.
Right.
They had a tight grip on labor, land, and resources, so they directly benefited from any increase in output.
Right. But it's a pretty unsustainable model in the long run, isn't it? I mean,
Yeah.
You're literally squeezing the life out of the people who are doing the work.
Exactly. Which brings us to the second and perhaps more surprising way that extractive systems can see growth.
Okay.
Sometimes these regimes will allow for some inclusive elements to take root,
Really?
either by design or by accident.
Wait, really? That seems counterintuitive. Why would they willingly loosen their grip?
Sometimes it's about maintaining a veneer of legitimacy, of showing the world that they're not completely closed off.
Right.
Other times it's about boosting certain sectors of the economy that they directly benefit from.
Okay, so it's not about Genuine altruism, but more like strategic self-interest.
Often, yes. And they bring up a really interesting example, Park Chung-hee's South Korea. Now, we talked about how South Korea eventually embraced many aspects of inclusive institutions.
Yeah.
But remember, Park Chung-hee himself was a military dictator.
Right. Not exactly a champion of democracy.
Not really.
Right. But he also oversaw this period of incredible economic growth. It's almost paradoxical.
And this is where it gets fascinating. The author suggests that because his power wasn't directly rooted in those older extractive institutions, he had a bit more leeway to allow for some economic opening.
So it's like he was playing both sides. Promoting growth, but maintaining a tight grip on power.
In a way, yes, of course it wasn't a sustainable model in the long run.
Right.
His authoritarianism eventually led to social unrest and ultimately his assassination.
Which brings us to the big kahuna of centrally controlled growth, the Soviet Union. They managed to drag themselves from an agrarian society to an industrial powerhouse in a few decades. How do they fit into this whole inclusive versus extractive framework?
The Soviet Union is a classic example of what the authors call extractive growth.
Okay.
Yes, they experienced rapid industrialization, but it was all under the iron fist of a totalitarian state.
So it's like they were playing a massive game of catch-up, but with forced labor and a complete lack of individual freedom.
Exactly. And while they managed to achieve some remarkable feats like their space program, it was all built on a very shaky foundation.
Because you can only squeeze so much out of a system before it breaks, right?
Precisely. And that's what happened in the 1970s.
Right.
The Soviet economy stagnated, they couldn't keep up with the innovations happening in the West, and the whole system eventually crumbled.
Which leads to the question that's been bugging me this whole time. If extractive institutions are so unsustainable and ultimately bad for everyone except the elites, why do they seem to stick around? Why do some countries seem trapped in this vicious cycle?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And unfortunately, there's no easy answer. But Why Nations Fail offers us a crucial insight. Understanding how these systems work, how they perpetuate themselves, is the first step towards breaking free.
It's like that old saying, knowledge is power. Once you see the strings, you can start to figure out how to cut them.
Exactly. And while the authors don't offer any simple solutions, they do leave us with a sense of hope. By understanding the dynamics at play, by advocating for inclusive institutions, by demanding better from our leaders, we can work towards creating a world where prosperity is shared, not hoarded.
That's a powerful message to end on. So for all of you listening, we've reached the end of our deep dive into why nations fail. But this is just the beginning of the conversation. Take these ideas, these insights, and apply them to the world around you. Question the systems you see in place. Demand better. And most importantly, never stop learning. Until next time, keep those thinking caps on and keep diving deep.